When I say that I believe in Sola Scriptura, the first thing that I hear from Catholics is that Jesus didn't give us a book, he gave us a church. And I don't disagree with that. What I would argue, though, is that the church he gave us was non-denominational, and not Catholic or Orthodox or any other religion that claims to be the one true church. Now, how can I make that claim, and how can I agree that Jesus didn't give us a Bible while still maintaining a Sola Scriptura stance? Well, I think it's important to look back at the early stages of Christianity and the church itself. The year is 33 AD. Jesus was just crucified, the apostles were just given the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, and now we're beginning to see what early Christianity looked like. Catholics would argue that Jesus gave his entire authority to Peter, who had unilateral power regarding the church on earth. But if you genuinely look at the first century history, you'll see that the church looked nothing like that. In fact, the entire idea of Christianity was just that this Jesus guy performed miracles, was crucified, and was resurrected before going up to heaven. Some early Christians argued that Jesus came down as a spirit and only appeared to be crucified. Some argued that Jesus came to save them from the merciless God of the Old Testament. You'll see John in particular argue against these heresies in his own epistles, but people didn't really have a solidified belief system yet. This is why Paul wrote so many letters and why God had John write letters to the 7 churches in Asia, because they were all right and wrong about different things that the apostles had to correct them on. Something that I think both Catholics and I agree on is the idea that when Jesus left, the highest authority on earth became the apostles. There was no New Testament at the time, so it was impossible to be Sola Scriptura. However, what we disagree on is how that authority was transferred. We don't have the apostles here on earth anymore, so does that mean that we don't have any authority anymore? No. Catholics would argue that the authority of the apostles was transferred through apostolic succession, meaning Peter plants a church and appoints a bishop, who plants another church and appoints another bishop, until we have what we have now. Thus, each bishop can trace their authority back to another bishop, all the way back to the original apostles. If you start with Peter and stay specifically in Rome, Catholics would argue that through apostolic succession, you end up with the Pope, who is considered the highest authority of God on earth. Now, I would disagree with that for 2 reasons. The first time we hear about apostolic succession, shocker, it's coming from Rome, specifically with Clement of Rome. He's dealing with the church in Corinth, where the younger generation essentially deposed the sitting elders and planted their own authority. Clement argued that the younger generation should stay unified and submit to the authority of the original elders, because they were given authority by the apostles themselves. The point that Clement is getting at is that the church leaders in Corinth received their doctrine from the primary sources, whereas the younger church was leaning unto their own understanding and creating disunity within the church. The younger church members weren't following the true path of Jesus, and Clement rebuked them for it. But Catholics would argue that this is proof that Jesus created a church with apostolic succession in mind. Now, I don't disagree with apostolic succession. I just disagree that through that succession, we end up with the same authority that the apostles had, especially the Pope. But we still haven't addressed how I can be Sola Scriptura when a Bible didn't even exist yet. If we continue looking at church history, the Old Testament canon wasn't finalized until either the end of the 1st century or the beginning of the 2nd century, and the New Testament canon wasn't finalized until the end of the 4th century. Christianity had gone from a sect of Judaism to an illegal religion to a legal religion to the mandatory religion, all before we had an established canon. In fact, the Council of Nicaea, where the church came together for the first ecumenical council, happened 60 years before we got our New Testament. How then can I be Sola Scriptura when the church didn't even have the Bible for its first 400 years? Let's go back to the apostles. When Jesus gave his apostles the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, he then gave the apostles the highest authority of God on earth, with Peter arguably being the greatest among equals. They were out planting churches, and because Christianity was so new, they got a lot of things wrong. And I'm talking about like the church members, not the apostles, of course. Even after these church members had learned from the primary sources themselves. This is where we see Peter, Paul, and John writing epistles to various churches throughout the new Christian world. In the meantime, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all writing their Gospels regarding the life, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, with Luke continuing the story in Acts. Now, you might immediately point out that neither Mark nor Luke were apostles, but they were writing specifically under the authority of Peter and Paul, respectively. These books would eventually become the New Testament, and because they were written with the apostles' authority, they carry the same authority that the apostles themselves had. These writings were seen as authoritative and were commonly read throughout church services in the early years of the church, which is where we get the traditions that Paul mentions in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 15. Does this mean that your local bishop or pastor doesn't have any authority? God forbid. It just means that their authority is superseded by the authority of those called directly by God, brought to us in the form of the Scriptures.